Hello, and welcome to our class. We've been going through a class series that I'm calling Letters Paul Didn't Write, and we're talking about the non-Pauline epistles in our New Testament. We've gone through the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, and now we've been studying James. Today we find ourselves in James chapter 3. So take a Bible and be turning there. We'll be reading from that in just a minute. James is writing a group of people, like we said in the first session, who have just been, because of persecution, scattered abroad. They were living in Jerusalem. They become Christians in Jerusalem. They were part of that exciting, together Jerusalem church. But when the persecution started to get really rough, and Stephen died as our first martyr, people began to leave Jerusalem, realizing that it was going to be really, really dangerous to be there. But this was all a part of the Lord's plan. We know it's part of how the Christian movement became very widespread throughout the Roman Empire, and eventually, within hundreds of years, became the religion of the empire. And so this was kind of the beginning movement. James is writing a very early letter, probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest, letter written in the New Testament. And it was written to Jews who had been scattered abroad, and he was reminding them of how they need to live their lives. First couple of chapters, he hits it pretty hard that they need to be focusing on how they treat the poor and realizing they shouldn't be treating the rich in discriminatory ways, but they should be treating poor people with humility, with kindness. And he reminds them that their faith is going to be reflected by their deeds. When they help the poor, that's a good thing. Their faith should drive them to help the poor and to be with them. And at the end, he says, faith without deeds is dead. We talked about that last week. So this week he talks not only about the deeds that they're doing, but also he focuses in on a specific troublesome matter, and that is the matter of how we speak, the words we choose, how we use our tongues. And James has a lot to say on that, a passage probably focusing more and a passage that steps on most of our toes quite a bit on the way we speak, the way we communicate, than any other passage in the New Testament. He spends a lot of time talking about the fact that we need to be aware of the fact that our words matter. If you're like me, you wish you had probably gotten this a little better when you were younger. I know some of you are very disciplined in what you say and have been brought up to be so. Some of you may be described as people that no one's ever heard you say anything bad or defamatory or condescending towards anyone. And I honor those people. I know a few of them. I've worked closely with several of them. I am not described generally as that person, as much as I would like to be. I'm not generally described as that person. I've got a little bit of my willfulness in me, and sometimes I speak in ways that I shouldn't. And when I was younger, a lot of it was because of ignorance. I'm sure with me, my parents had bigger fish to fry than just having to micromanage every word that came out of my mouth. And so they tried really hard, Mom especially. They tried really hard, but I still stuck my foot in my mouth a lot. I even today, I try to be gracious and kind in everything I say, but I mess up sometimes. Do you have that issue? Do you ever experience that? You really try hard, but sometimes you just mess up. Sometimes it's intentional that you say things that are hurtful or unkind because you're fed up or stressed out or angered or whatever, and you're not in control of what you say very well, and you haven't gotten how to just keep your mouth closed during those times. I can identify. I know what you're saying. I think I'm certainly better than that I used to be, but I'm still working on it. When I was young, though, a lot of my misspoken words were unintentional. I didn't mean for my words to be received in the way that they were. An example of that is I once told a girl in whom I was interested. Now, again, I was a teenager at this point in time. I was raised among boys in a very testosterone-enhanced environment. My mom had a very thick skin and had to have because of the environment that my brothers and I were raised in. We loved hunting and fishing and outdoors, and we pretty much spoke our minds, I guess, a lot of times. And this girl, I was interested in her, maybe not as much as she was interested in me, but I remember telling her something like, I thought she was pretty for someone who was a little on the heavy side. Well, I think I genuinely meant that as a compliment. I didn't mean for it to be received poorly. Knowing what I know now, however, and having had a wife who I'm sure I've wounded a number of times unintentionally, having had daughters who I've seen go through the wounding of misspoken young men, and I know that had a very negative impact on her. In fact, I don't know when she stopped crying, but it was sometime after she left me. And the looks I got from her friends for days afterward reflect the fact that they thought my word choice was a poor one as well. Obviously, that's not something I would do now. I learned my lesson in that situation. No longer did I have the possibility of any kind of a relationship with her moving forward because she thought I was a jerk, frankly. And from that one statement that I made, I could see how she might see it that way. Again, not my intention, but it's the way that it worked out. And it's amazing that our words, whether intentionally or unintentionally, can stir the tenderest of affection in others, but it can also inflict the greatest pain. Obviously, as followers of Christ, our mission with our words should always be to reflect Christ, should always be to lead people towards Him, to draw people into our fellowship and into His kingdom, not push them away. And for that reason, James' warnings to heed what we say very carefully is one that is well taken, one that we need to think about, and one that we need to continue to strive for in our lives. James is following up his correction on how they treated the underprivileged in his audience, and he may be continuing that thought with reminding them that their words, whether they be spoken towards those who are underprivileged or others, their words matter, and that their tongues can do real damage. Let's look at what James has to say. We're going to look at the first 12 verses initially of James chapter 3. Read that with me if you would. Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue is also a fire, the world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body and sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. Well, again, those are some harsh words, some difficult words, some ones that sting, I think, most of us, and cause us to realize how important it is to be careful about what we say, to use wisdom, we'll talk about in the latter part of the chapter, to determine what we say and to determine its impact not only on those who hear it, but also on the kingdom in its broad state, in its broader stance. He starts off by saying, not many of you should be teachers. I get the sense here that the audience that he's speaking to, he considers them to be less mature in terms of faith. And their behavior, apparently, and in particular, their words, show their immaturity. He gives them a little grace early on by talking about the fact that we all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect. In other words, we're all going to mess up with this one. This one's a challenging one. And so we get some grace in terms of the fact that we can all look back and see that our words have not always been carefully chosen. Our words have not always had the impact that we intended. Our words have been spoken in such a way as that they hurt others or defamed others. Certainly not what we want, not a good way for us to represent our Lord. But James here admits this is tough. This is a difficult one. And it's one that we need to realize that we all need to work on. He gives 4 illustrations of how little things steer big things. And again, the illustrations are about how the tongue, a little part of the body, can move us or steer us in ways that either we want to go or we don't want to go, depending on how disciplined we are in what we say. He talks about bits in the mouths of animals, that a small bit in the mouth of a horse or a mule or an ox can turn a large animal this way or that. He talks about rudders on ships and how a small rudder can turn a great ship. It can be turned by a very, very comparatively small rudder. A small spark, he says, starts great forest fires. Small things can lead to big things, or in this case, big trouble. And so it's really important that we watch what's going on with our tongue. He says the tongue is a small part, but metaphorically, it can steer our bodies, and it certainly, we'll talk about later, reflects our hearts. Which is why, again, we need to be careful that what we say matches what we believe we should be saying, matches our goal, matches our heart, matches our desire to want to represent Christ. A tongue not under close control can corrupt a person, a church, or a family. If someone is regularly out of control with what they say, whether it be in anger or whether it just be in meanness or whether it be in impurity, whatever it is, somebody who's out of control in what they say can disparage the reputation of a person, of a family, or of a church, or of a community. We've known people in history who regularly misspeak, who are regularly cruel or mean in what they say, and we know the kind of feelings that brings up. We know that that's not a good thing. Again, he says the tongue is difficult to tame. In verse 8, he says it's full of deadly poison. In other words, be careful, because your tongue can do great harm. It really can. It can do great harm to those you care about. It can do great harm to the people that you work with. It can do great harm in the community, and it can sully the reputation of any organization, including the church, with which you're associated. So we have to be careful of the fact that our tongues can do great harm. And in this, he says, with our tongue we can both praise God and curse men. And he says that should never be. That just should not happen. People who follow Jesus should not have that kind of dualism going on in their hearts and in their lives. You can't praise God and curse men with the same tongue, because if you do, the praising God is simply not genuine. Simply not genuine. And that's why we have to be very, very, very careful of what we say. He gives several illustrations talking about how can fresh water and salt water come from the same spring. He asks them a question. All of these have the implied answer of no. He says, can an olive come from a fig tree, or can a fig come from a grapevine? And his point made is that while the tongue may be small, it can have a great impact in terms of good or evil. The words we say, he's saying, reflect the heart of the speaker. And so while we may say good things in certain contexts, if we're speaking bad things to the people that we don't care for, if we're speaking curses or being derogatory or defamatory in the things that we say, then our hearts are disingenuous. They're not right. And it's really, really important, James is saying, that we get this down, that this is a crucial matter. He's showing them that in their actions right now, they're not representing their church very well. They're not representing their Lord very well. And the same could be said of us. when our tongues aren't disciplined, when we aren't in control of what we say and how we say it to other people. He says, in reading on, he says that in our words we have to reflect wisdom. We have to speak from wisdom, which means that we've got to consider what we say. Compare it to our goal of representing Christ in this world. Compare it to the goal of being Christ in this world. Is Christ seen through the words that I'm about to say? And it's a measure that we all have to use, which means, and back in an earlier chapter, he talked about the fact that we need to be slow to speak. Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Slow to speak says I'm considering what I'm saying, and I'm comparing it to the wisdom that comes from heaven. And I'm saying, does this match it? Is this a wise thing to say? And should I be saying that? In chapter here at the end of chapter 3, verses 13 through 18, he talks about the fact that there may be two kinds of wisdom. A worldly wisdom, and then one that comes from heaven. Let's look at the differences between those two. Start with verse 13 and read through the end of the chapter with me. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. If you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, in quotation marks, does not come down from heaven, but it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. There's a good memory verse. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So what's he saying about the kind of wisdom that we need to be looking at? The kind of wisdom that he's speaking about here. Two kinds of wisdom. One is fleshly and of the earth. The New Testament or the New International Version people put that wisdom in quotation marks, meaning that the author is saying that it's not really wisdom because it's unspiritual to have envy and selfish ambition to determine and to drive your words. Those two things are going to be the things that drive evil words coming out of our mouths, and we can't be those people. If you deal with the poor in terms of envy and selfish ambition, you're going to be putting them down to lift yourself up. And that's exactly what some of them, I suppose, were doing. And so he's saying, if that is what the wisdom is that you're choosing your words from, it's going to lead to bad things. He calls it earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. And that's definitely not good. Definitely not a place we want to be. So what is this wisdom that he talks about? This wisdom that comes down from above. So we know it doesn't come from envy and selfish ambition. It comes from something else. We've got to get that out of our hearts. We've got to get humility and selflessness into our hearts to be able to speak with the kind of wisdom that God gives us, the kind of wisdom that comes from heaven. Verse 15, such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, spiritual, and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. So again, we want to get that out. That's not what we want. So starting in verse 17, he talks about this wisdom that comes down from heaven. And this is the kind of wisdom he's saying we want to draw our words from. We want to use this kind of wisdom. And he says this kind of wisdom is going to look very different. If we choose our words based on the wisdom that comes from heaven, it's going to be obvious because they're going to have these features that he gives us associated with them. They're going to be pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, full of good fruit, impartial, and sincere. Let's look at each of those specifically. He says that wisdom that comes down from heaven is going to be reflected in speech that is pure. That means things that are good, things that aren't evil or filthy. They're going to have a purity to them. And so our words chosen from wisdom that comes down from heaven will be pure. Secondly, he says they'll be peace-loving. In other words, they're words that speak into peace, not division, not conflict. They're words that speak not defamatory. They're words that speak peace into a situation. And we have to consider if our wisdom is from heaven, are our words going to bring about peace? They need to be considerate, which means we think of others. We think of, and we consider before we choose them. We consider how our words will impact other people. And so are our words considerate? And if they are, then they come down from heaven. We're drawing from that wisdom. Are they submissive? In other words, do they condescend or look down on others? And if our words are looking down on others, they're not submissive. We need to be submissive in what we say if we're drawing from the wisdom of heaven. They need to be full of mercy, understanding, and forgiving the faults in others. We know that other people struggle with some of the same things we struggle with. And even if they're different things, we all struggle. And so we need to be understanding of that and give mercy as we've been given mercy, as he talks about in an earlier chapter. We need to be giving mercy if we expect mercy. He says it needs to be associated with good fruit. In other words, good things come out of what we say. We're motivating and moving people to be good things. Encouragement is a great example of that. When you encourage someone in what they're doing, you tend to increase the likelihood that they're going to continue doing those things. As you encourage them in doing good, that's fruit. That brings about fruit from what we say. Is what you say bringing about good fruit? It needs to be impartial, meaning it can't speak down on one group as opposed to another. It can't be lifting your particular group up while putting down another. Racism obviously fits into this concept that if our words are racist, then they're going to be lowering another group and raising our group. We're better than they are. Our words need to be impartial, and submissive as well. And they need to be sincere. And sincere means they're not pretentious. We're not pretending when we talk. We're not acting one way but really thinking another. All right, we need to be honest and sincere in what we're saying, not pretentious. And so that's a great test for our words, for the words that we choose to say to others. The words that we choose when we're posting on social media. Man, that's been a big one here lately. We need to consider and put our words to this test before we post anything on social media. Is it pure? Is it peace-loving? Is it considerate? Is it submissive? Is it full of mercy, good fruit, impartial and sincere? Are our words that we choose that? And if it's not, then it needs not be out there. Keep it to yourself. We need to keep it to ourselves. I'm talking to me too. We need to keep it to ourselves if we have something along those lines. And we need to discipline our words and draw from that heavenly wisdom that James is reminding us of here. The last verse, verse 18, peacemakers who sow in peace bring forth a harvest of righteousness. If we're about being peacemakers, if we're speaking peace into circumstances, and man, this last election was a great example of that. And in your conversation and in your posts on social media and in the things that you said to others, were you bringing about peace in those discussions? Or was it more about division and your side over another side or something like that? He says, peacemakers who sow peace produce a harvest of righteousness. And that's what we want to do. We want to be people of peace who are known for peace. Doesn't mean we don't have an opinion, obviously. We can certainly have an opinion, but we can determine to speak only those words that draw people together, even if it's people that we disagree with. Even if we don't like their view on things, we can continue to speak words of peace and draw them in. So this chapter is both fitting and painful in modern times. It seems that our cultural trends seem to have dispensed with polite, affirming speech and resorted to harsh, critical, and condescending speech as a way of communication. I mean, I think we see it in everyday life. We see it in the news. We see it in on social media. We see it in preachers and different things that we can go to hear. We see it in political speech. All different ways we see this kind of speech, that our level of speech has become lower and lower and lower, and obviously it's coming from this earthly wisdom that he talks about and not the heavenly wisdom. And as followers of Jesus, we simply can't let that be good enough. We simply can't join in with our culture and give them the same kind of trash that they give us, or joining a group in culture and condescending another group just as they did, whether that be racial groups or political groups or whatever it is. We simply can't join that kind of speech. We can have an opinion, but we can't be putting other people down. That's just not That's not the way we as Christians should operate. And I think James is saying that here. Because we see groups torn apart. We see communities torn apart, churches torn apart, families torn apart by things that people say. I've heard people say things like, well, don't get offended by what I say. I just say what I think. I had someone say that to me one time. And I'm like, well, what you say is offensive. So I am going to be offended by that. And I don't know what they thought that don't be offended by me is going to produce. I don't know what they thought that was going to mean, but it was offensive. And, they wanted to make that my fault, that if it's offensive, it's my fault. Well, no, that's not the case. I had someone else say to me one time, this person had said something rude to me, and when I confronted his rudeness, he said, I'm just stating the facts. Okay, well, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm not disagreeing with what you said. I'm disagreeing with how you said it and how you said it was rude. And the fact is that we may be factual in what we say, but we can say that, we can say it in kinder ways. All right, guys, you've learned, especially those of you who are married, man, if your wife has a weight issue and she says, does this make me look fat? You can say just the facts if you want to, but it's going to have its, if you're blunt about that, it's going to have ramifications, right? You're going to have an angry, sullen wife for a while, or depending on how she handles frustration, it could be otherwise. The fact is how we deliver the facts can be really important. It's easy to say, listen, I don't care about your weight in terms of how you look, but if it affects your health, then we ought to both be concerned about it. Is that a better way of saying it? Yeah, probably. And again, we need to be considering our impact on another person, considering what we say and how we say it, and not excusing ourselves by hurting other people and saying, well, I didn't mean it that way, so it's your fault if you're hurt. That's just not the case. And as followers of Christ, that can never, ever, ever be good enough. All right, I just say what I think, or I'm just saying the facts. Whatever it is, that can't be good enough. If we've hurt others with our words, we need to make that right. And we need to be people who decide that we're not going to hurt others if we can help it. And that's really true. Here, look at this. You want an illustration on how what we say is important. If there were 100 of us gathered and in a touchy situation, but with another group, and 99 of us use kindness and consideration in how we deal with it, but one person loses their temper and says hateful things, guess what people remember? They remember what the one person said, not what the 99 said. And our group gets characterized by what the one person says. Remember that. You're a member of Westside. And so the things you say in public, the things you may put in the newspaper or out on social media, particularly if it has to do with political issues that may have religious attachments, remember that as you say that, you're saying that, you're not just saying that yourself. You can tell yourself all you want to, that you're only representing you. But if people know that you go to church with us, you're representing us in what you say. And so be careful. Use the wisdom that comes from heaven. Use the measure that he talks about here at the end of chapter 3. We need to take James's advice and use wisdom in what we say. Be slow to speak in what we say, especially what we say to unbelievers and those who are fragile. Again, there's never an excuse for being overly harsh with someone in need. Even when people are being harsh and rude to us, it's important for us to be consistent in being kind back to them. It's what Jesus did. And it's what he expects us to do. So I ask you today, do your words represent Jesus well on a regular basis? When you look at that list in verse 17 of the chapter we just read, what do you struggle with? What are some of the things you deal with? What does it do you struggle with pure speech, with peace-loving speech, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, yielding good things, impartial, and sincere? What is it that you struggle with, and where do you find yourself falling short sometimes? Here's a fact. There's never been a time in my memory that peacemakers are more needed than they are now. Right now. If we have a hope of our community coming together, of our nation coming together, and if we have a hope of Christians coming together, it can only be as Christians become peacemakers. As Christians, don't adopt this us versus them mentality, but as we submit to one another in Christ, and as we be committed to being peacemakers who are wanting to bring people together. That's what we've got to become, because that's what Jesus was. And if we're to be like him, we need to do the things he did. That's our lesson for today. Hope that was challenging to you. It certainly was to me. And we'll look next week at James chapter 4 as we get towards the end of this book. Thank you for joining me today, and goodbye.